My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic, multiverse. It's Mega Christmas, strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
And we do it several times to see which beginning the public likes best. Also, a small anecdote because of our getup this week, our setup. It just reminds me of there was this team in professional League of Legends. They were called Moscow 5, and they were like a Russian team, and they used to have like one headset around their neck for their microphone, one headset over their ears to like have the game sound, and one headphones inside their ear underneath the headset so that they could communicate with each other, because there were, different languages and different setups, and with us trying to figure out a way to hear each other, it reminded me of that.
Yes, so we are once again recording far ahead of when we would normally record. It's actually fairly late at night for me, and I've had a full day of Zoom calls, so my energy levels are not going to be what they usually are. Beeper, where are you at today?
I am at a higher energy level that I really should be considering the day I've had, but long days are fun sometimes, but at least it was a pretty calm day for me. But yeah, it does seem a little weird to be recording 2 days later.
Yeah, I think that's how long it's been.
Yeah,
but you know what, that's the way she goes. And this will probably be a shorter episode just because neither of us are at full capacity energy wise.
And I think we'll also be able to get to the bottom of this question well enough within the time.
Yeah, so this topic here, discussing variations on the origins for Batman and Superman, this was an idea I had some time ago, and it just occurred to me that, both Batman and Superman have existed for over 80 years, which means there have been many different opportunities to tell their story over and over again in different reboots of the comics, different TV shows, different movies. And so now what we have, I think it's probably unique. I mean, maybe there's other characters who fit this bill, but you have characters who have these origin stories, and everyone who comes along kind of puts their own spin on it. So there's these different variations of the origins for the characters. I don't know, Beeper, off the top of your head, can you think of any other characters that would be in a similar kind of story in terms of many different versions of their origin?
Well, I mean, as long as we're not going for low-hanging fruit in the Joker, which, I mean, I guess fits under the Batman umbrella, because I feel like a lot with the reboots that these two superheroes have gotten, I feel like their character, like their villains, have also had slightly different ones, and I think that's a little more common with like new iterations of superheroes. Even if the superhero has a similar origin story, then the villains sometimes get a little bit of a change to how or why they happen to be the way they are. But beyond that, I can't really think. Like, I guess maybe Count Dracula. He's been in a lot of different media, and it's variations on how exactly he became a vampire.
So we'll start with Superman, because Superman predated Batman anyway, so it just seems to make sense. Beeper, if you had to describe like the origin of Superman from like his birth until the point he debuts as Superman, like what would you say is generally the story?
For some reason that may or may not have to do with their own hubris, Krypton was about to get destroyed, and Jor-El sent his son away to survive the destruction. He crashed in Arkansas, grew up as a nice country boy with good-natured parents, and then discovered he could help people and became Superman because he didn't want his Clark Kent identity to be swarmed with the glamour or troubles.
Wonderful. That's a great summarization of all the variations on Superman's origin. The first thing to touch on is something you kind of alluded to, is the state of Krypton, because every version of Superman's story involves the planet Krypton blowing up.
In some
But there's
way
been
or
a couple
another.
different explanations as to how the planet gets destroyed. I think in the original story, the planet just kind of all of a sudden exploded. Like nobody anticipated it coming. But
Yeah,
more,
I think because that's the. I feel like that's the one that I know the best, but I also know that it's the one that like Megamind, which is one of my favorite animated movies, is like parodying. So I don't know if that's why I feel like that's the quintessential one, or if it is something more.
yeah. So I think with both Superman and Batman, there's actually instances where one version of the story things happen by chance, and then there's other versions where things are more almost predetermined. So I think it was probably like even Superman the movie from the 70s that sort of introduced the idea that Jor-El was a scientist who knew that the planet was dying and tried to inform the government that the planet was dying and that they should try to leave the planet. But the leaders of the people of Krypton were didn't believe him. They were like, "Oh, you're just a crazy scientist."
It's suicide. No, it's worse. It's genocide.
Be warned, Jor-El. The Council has already evaluated this outlandish theory of yours.
My friends, you know me to be neither rash nor impulsive. I'm not given to wild, unsupported statements. And I tell you that we must evacuate this planet immediately.
It isn't that we question your honor. The facts are undeniable. It's your conclusions we find unsupportable.
This planet will explode within 30 days, if not sooner.
I tell you, Krypton is simply shifting its orbit.
Jor-El, be reasonable.
My friend, I have never been otherwise. This madness is yours.
This discussion is terminated. The decision of the Council is final.
So that's the explanation as to why Krypton blows up. Is actually the fault of the Kryptonians not taking care of their planet, which, of course, has lots of allegories in the modern context.
Yeah, I think the other thing but I feel like there's a difference between the ones where it's like they passively were not taking care of their planet well enough, and then the one where it's like something that was technically avoidable, but that they didn't avoid, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like I think in the Man of Steel movie, they talk about how they were mining the planet for resources, and they basically overdid it, and that's what led to the planet's collapse.
Yeah.
There's also a version where the Brainiac computer kind of infects the planet and essentially leads to like manipulates events and things so that the planet's ecosystem starts to collapse.
Right, and that would be introducing a supervillain as well.
So do you like the version of Krypton's destruction that involves like a climate change kind of connection, or do you prefer it just happened? Like, I think it was actually one version was like it wasn't the planet that was exploding, but the star that, like, the sun of that planet that was like
Yeah.
next to it that exploded.
I think both have kind of their own strengths to it, because one of them is like not listening. Like, I feel like the second one you just described is a bit more like not listening to like people who can, like, prophetic things that are out of our control. But the first one I think is more and more applicable to modern day, and kind of was always, I don't know. I like the idea of Krypton kind of being victim of its own hubris, because it emphasizes what Superman is and why he shouldn't be the way that others were. Even though he doesn't necessarily himself learn about this until later, and sometimes never at all, it does kind of add to that idea that, like, he somewhere knows that he shouldn't be too full of himself, or the fact that he's not too full of himself proves that he's different from, something that's doomed to failure. Whereas the kind of random, but his dad was the only one to catch it, and that's why he managed to jettison him out of the planet, it just lacks the depth, not just of analogy with the world, but the depth of how it can form his character, and how it contrasts his character with not just other villains like Zod, but like the idea of what a race of people who are much more powerful than most people would be, you know, and I don't know if you've watched Invincible, but there's a slightly different version of that in the Invincible, both the comics and the show, and it's like, yeah, no, if a bunch of people were more powerful than almost every other planet, they probably wouldn't be full of nice guys.
Because the state of Krypton provides an explanation as to why he was sent away as a baby by himself and
Yeah.
not with his parents. Because if it's a reality where, like, the sun exploded and they had to act very quickly, maybe you could buy the fact that, okay, all they had was a spaceship for like a small child. In the more climate change, we've actually like destroyed Krypton ourselves approach, they often explain that Jor-El had to build the spaceship in secret because he would have been put in prison if it had been discovered that he was building an escape pod or an escape ship. And
Yeah, both have their place, but I did always find that it was weird that he built a spaceship like only big enough for his son. Like, I understand it was because it was in secret and everything, but like, it still always struck me as a bit weird. Like, this guy is the only one who has the foresight and planning to do this, and yet he only plans to have enough for a baby to escape.
yeah, and then there's some versions of the story where Jor-El has like, he knows exactly where he's sending his son. He's like, oh, you're going to go to Earth and you're going to have powers there that will protect you. And, there's some versions where he visits Earth as like a kind of like a test to see what Earth is like. And then there's versions where he just sort of like sends the rocket out into space, hoping that it's going to end up somewhere. So
Yeah, that
would
was
you
a weird
prefer
one.
that Jor-El didn't know exactly where Clark or Kal-El was going?
See, I don't feel as strongly about that one, because, like, all it really affects is what the giant floating head in the Fortress of Solitude tells him. And I think that ultimately that's not as big a deal. But I think between the two, I kind of actually prefer the fact that Earth was randomly chosen. It makes less sense, but it feeds into the whole, Earth is special narrative that, some people like and some people pointedly dislike. So, depending, I think, on which side of that you're on, it may be more or less important.
Yeah, it certainly helps inform the Judeo-Christian allegory that gets associated with Superman, that like his father sent him to, be a beacon of hope or to protect the people of Earth.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that I think they kind of go more heavily in with that idea, and I don't think it's a bad one. And I think it's fun to
So we're
kind of.
leaving Krypton now. We don't seem to have settled on like what's the best explanation for like why the planet's blowing up, or why he's being sent by himself, or why his like does Jor-El know where he's sending his son. I think it's kind of funner when he just is like very in a panicked state, sending his son off into space, hoping he'll survive somewhere.
Yeah, I also think that the differences in why or how Jor-El sends him has a lot more to do with Jor-El's character than Superman's. So it kind of depends where you want him to go.
Thankfully, one consistent part of Superman's story is always that he's found in Smallville, Kansas by Jonathan and Martha Kent, and he's raised by them as a human, or believed to be a human, until his powers start emerging. And this is again where we have a couple different variations of the story. In the Silver Age of comics, like in the 40s, 50s, 60s, there was this idea that Clark was Superboy, that he, as a teenager and as like a preteen, literally wore like an exact version of his Superman outfit and like did Superman stuff in Smallville just as Superboy.
And helped JFK remain alive, I think, in one of them. Not in the 40s, obviously, but eventually.
Yeah.
Pretty sure there's a Superboy story where he keeps JFK alive.
So do you like the idea of him basically like, I don't know, you could call that training, I guess, for becoming Superman by having been Superboy first?
Nope. I highly dislike that idea. I never got the appeal of it, and I always thought it was a much better idea for him to have always been in full possession of his power and raised with the awareness of what it meant from a young age. But then that he only really came into it after he left the small town and got into the bigger world. I don't know. I can't really explain why. I don't think it has a better story value, but I don't know. It was the way it was originally, and I like that idea that he's just, he lives in a small town and he's doing good, and he might like help farmers around and stuff like that, but not save the world until he moves into, the big city and suddenly is like, oh wow, I could and probably should be doing a lot more than I was, and then kind of grows into that awareness. It would also mean that like Smallville doesn't exist, and I don't like Smallville. I don't like the concept of it. I think it's really weird, him and Lex Luthor being like childhood friends, and that, this hick would go to save the world, and that he's being an angsty teenager. Like, because again, part of like Superman is he is a lot more than human. Having him be a teenager and be emotional and be kind of like that weaker, lesser version of him, I think goes against what the character is. And again, it's not bad. I just, personal preference, I don't like it at all.
See, I like the way the Smallville TV series addressed his formation as a teenager, because it kind of shows he started using his powers to help people without like putting on the full-on garb of being a superhero. And I think there is some poetic justice to him, like having had a friendship with Lex Luthor, before they go their separate ways. Like it creates a real like Fox and the Hound kind of situation where it adds like a little element of tragedy to their relationship. Because in versions of the story where Superman and Clark Kent don't meet Lex Luthor until he's fully grown in Metropolis, it's a very different kind of relationship when you're meeting them as adults as opposed to meeting them when they're younger.
Yeah, I can understand that. But at the same time, I think it also takes away from Luthor as a villain. in the sense that what he represents is, you know, in some ways the antithesis of Superman, but in other ways also doing what Superman doesn't want to do, using his power to affect change directly. Unless you're talking about the Injustice game where Superman does end up going kind of the Lex Luthor route, and it does happen every once in a while, but it seems strange to build up that dichotomy when they were children because they weren't able to affect that change at that time.
Okay, where I think Smallville as a show went too far is that like halfway through its 10-year run, he starts spending a bunch of time in Metropolis. He starts establishing his presence as a reporter, and he's essentially like doing Superman stuff without publicly like making himself known as Superman.
Yeah, but I think there's a general consensus that Smallville lasted way too long for what it was. So maybe it's just, it should have ended halfway through the show.
So there's a version of the story where, after his time in Smallville, whether he's been Superboy or he's done nothing super heroic or he's done like what they did in Smallville, most versions of the story have him spend some time at the Fortress of Solitude. In the Christopher Reeve movies, you find out that he actually spends 12 years at the Fortress of Solitude learning about Krypton, learning about history, learning how to control his powers. And so he's like a 30-year-old man kind of coming out of this like 12-year sabbatical when we meet him as Superman. And when you see him as Superman, he has total control of his powers. He's developed his persona as Clark Kent, as the reporter. He, knows how to behave when he's Superman. And that contrasts very directly to like the Man of Steel Superman, who literally within like the span of a few days discovers where he's from and gets the costume for the first time, and then all of a sudden has to deal with his first major threat.
And the S on his chest is a symbol that means hope, I think. I thought that was dumb, but I like the Fortress of Solitude years aspect of it once again because you get a mature, ready superhero who starts doing like I don't know, like I think that most heroes having the learning curve is nice, and I think that like things like Batman Year One or like a lot of like the comics that talk about Spider-Man starting off are great, but Superman just doesn't seem like it suits him for two reasons. First one is, especially if you, and I have consumed mostly some of the older Superman comics and the really old animated show, he is just fully capable of stopping anything anytime he wants, right? He's so overwhelmingly powerful that it seems weird and clumsy to have him learn the ropes, as it were. And then also because he is supposed to be just the symbol of, the monolithic persona of pure justice that might be a little naive, but is still able to compensate for it because he's so powerful. And I don't know. I feel like that's more what Superman is. Superman to me has always been more of a symbol than a hero in relation to like a lot of more people. And, and that is part of the, I don't know, it's part of the thing where like most people know about Superman and Clark Kent. Not as many people know that Kal-El exists, and I think that's where Superman belongs, is as Clark Kent hiding Superman, not as Kal-El trying to become a person in his new city.
I think I'm partial to Clark Kent Kal-El, who has less time to prepare. I kind of like the idea that he's sort of thrown into the middle of stuff without having had so much prep time. I kind of get what you're saying about him being like the first superhero, and therefore you kind of like for him to be like the gold standard in the world. You would hope he's like fully formed and fully ready to jump into the arena. But I think it makes him a little more relatable when he perhaps at maybe not 12 years, but even like maybe he's working off of a shorter training period, and he sort of has to jump into things before he thinks he's ready.
Yeah, and that's fair. I just, again, especially, and I don't know, maybe that's my bias of the DC versus Marvel thing. I don't think Superman is supposed to be relatable. I don't think he should be, but that's kind of my take on the character. And I don't think I'm the only one who has that take. Maybe I am, but like that Superman isn't meant to be relatable because he's meant to be a standard by which everything else is kind of measured. And I think that's, that is kind of what can often make a lot of the DC stories, especially with the Justice League, more interesting. It is like kind of how do they measure up against against the threat or with the help of Superman, and the only limitations that he really has are that he can only be in one place at a time.
So there we have it. That is kind of a super breeze through of the variations in Superman's origin story. We both have our preferences and how it all plays out, but once again, it's just kind of cool to see how different stories will lean into different elements more. Like there's a version of Superman's comics origin called Birthright, where I believe as a young adult he travels the world and kind of gets to know the planet Earth before kind of settling in Metropolis, which it's a neat idea as well. But I guess if I was like creating my definitive Superman origin, it probably wouldn't involve that.
It has a very Samurai Jack opening episode feel to it. I mean, there's also what is Under the Red Sun? Is that what it's called? No, I'm thinking of Under the Red Hood.
It's just Superman Red Sun.
Yeah, Superman Red Sun. I think is still a very interesting and fun idea. Just he landed in Russia and then became the Soviet icon, because in a lot of ways his character is still very similar. Like he's still trying to do good. It's just I feel like that story was a little heavy-handed on how much propaganda could affect him or affect somebody, but I still think that somewhere in there's a good Superman story without Clark Kent, and that's kind of neat.
All right, let's move on to Batman. Beeper, what would be like the most basic interpretation of Batman's origin story?
Rich kid goes to the opera with his parents. When they leave, I believe he's always seeing Faust, but I can't remember. And then they leave. His parents get mugged in the alley. The mugging goes wrong. They get shot, and he becomes Batman. He becomes vengeance. He becomes justice. And he never quits because he doesn't know how, because clearly there's a lot of psychological damage that happened that he never dealt with properly.
All right, so let's start. Yeah, so the beginning of Batman's origin obviously involves the deaths of Thomas and Martha Wayne. Now, some versions they're going to the opera, some versions they're going to a movie. And I'd like to believe that if you're taking like an 8 or 9-year-old with you, you're going to go see a movie instead of an opera. Like what kind of, I know even if you're a rich kid, what kind of 9-year-old wants to go to the opera?
I mean, me, but I'm weird, so I don't know. Actually, I don't know if I could have sat through an entire opera at that age, but like I definitely wanted to. But you're right, movies does also make somewhat sense, but I also feel like, I don't know, the opera is the kind of quintessential, oh yes, he was rich, very rich. It kind of like pushes something that, is kind of important, like the degree to which Bruce Wayne is rich.
Now, one of the biggest questions that always comes up in different explanations of Batman's origin is if whether the murder of his parents was just a random coincidence that they just happened to turn down the wrong alley and there just happened to be a mugger, or if it was some kind of organized murder coordinated by people in the mob.
Yeah, and I think this also somewhat has more of a bearing on like Thomas Wayne as a character rather than Bruce/Batman. But I also, again, I prefer the random one, because I always feel like whenever the story has it organized in a way that it is a specific person that he can find and hunt down and then finds a deeper motive and hunts it down, it always kind of leaves this kind of like, well, if that's what it was, if he was able to pinpoint it very specifically, wouldn't he stop being Batman at that point? Like in some, in some versions, he's been Batman for so long he doesn't know anything better. But like, I think that was one of the things with like, the Batman, the new movie, where it kind of goes there, but then it's like, well, I mean, he's been doing this for 2 years, and he has officially discovered the exact reason for his father's death and avenged it, like his parents' death, and avenged it. Why is he still Batman after that? Like, I think, and again, I think in this case, the character of Gotham City as a character, which I think is something that is quite important for Batman, it makes more sense if it was a random mugging or random shooting that happened because Gotham is the way Gotham is. And that kind of has Batman / Bruce Wayne eternally locked in the struggle with this city that he is simultaneously trying to change and to protect, but also needs to be the way it is for him to continue having his identity. So I'm for random mugging more than mob, especially if the mob also does what Batman 89 did and make it the Joker shot his parents, because it was a cool line, have you ever danced with the devil in the pale moonlight? But it was kind of corny and I didn't like it. Like, I like the movie, just not that specific aspect of it that Jack Napier shot Bruce Wayne's parents.
Yeah, and I mean, even through the lens of what was an organized thing by the mob, there's been various explanations for that. Like in one version of the comics, Thomas Wayne basically helps arrest a mobster during a costume party, and so that mobster from prison's like, I want to hit on this guy because he got me in prison, and that's why the Waynes get killed. In the Batman movie, it's a political campaign. In the Joker movie, Thomas Wayne and Martha are killed just because they kind of get caught up in like the whole riot started by Arthur Fleck. So, I agree with you though. I prefer when it's random because I feel like it's like there's almost like a poetry and like just on like I think it adds to the tragedy when it's like it could have been anyone whose parents were killed that night and just happened to be Bruce's.
I also like the idea that in almost like the other thing that I find is bad, well, not bad, but problematic sometimes when they have the mob set into it is that, and this is more of a more recent trend. It's like, oh, Thomas Wayne wasn't actually as good as you think. He wasn't actually trying to save Gotham. Whereas the random one is like, no, this was a guy who was actively trying to help Gotham City get better. Whether he's a doctor or just a really swell guy, he was actively trying to make Gotham City a better place, and he was pumping a lot of money into it. And yet, the very thing he was trying to save still killed him. And that, again, the poetry in that I think is better.
So we've established the different versions of how his parents get killed. I think we're both in favor of just being a random mugging. Now, the nature of the killer's identity is another element of Batman's origin that changes because there's one version of the story where it's never identified who it was that killed his parents. That it was just some random guy who shot them and then ran away and was never seen again. In some versions, they literally identify him as a guy named Joe Chill, and there's some versions where he gets put in jail right away. Some versions where he escapes the justice system and is like put in jail decades later. I think there's one comic I have where it shows as a fully formed Batman, he actually tracks down Joe Chill. And then there's the version from the Tim Burton movie where it's the Joker who kills his parents, and I've never liked that.
Yeah, and of those three, I still again prefer the random person. And when it is a specific person, I do prefer him being found later on, or like he escapes justice, especially if it's through corruption, which makes Batman kind of fight on two fronts. I don't dislike what the Dark Knight did, where like I kind of dislike the fact that Bruce was gonna kill him, and the overemphasis they had on the League of Shadows. But the idea that like Bruce Wayne is denied his vengeance because of the way the city is. But the only problem with that is then, it kind of leans into the organized crime problem again, which, can be solved, but sometimes it just, it's semi-solved and it leaves a vacuum, and that's okay, but I also feel like it's the kind of thing that isn't as satisfying and as central to the character as it being, just a random guy who got away, or a person who ended up escaping the justice system, or that was out of reach.
Yeah, I think it makes it very almost tragic that, it's like he goes out every night still looking for the one who got away.
And even more so if he knows he won't be able to find him.
So, all right, I think we're in more agreement on the Batman origin. So we want it to be a random mugging, the killer, we don't know who he is, and he gets away. And then if he is discovered, it's like after decades, so that he's it provides motivation for Bruce to pursue the road of Batman, because it shows that like just the justice system didn't support him.
Yeah, and he just becomes so very obsessed with something ethereal, that it does take over. And I think that is the thing, is that to be Superman, you just have to be a good guy trying to do good things. To be Batman, you need to be eternally chasing something that ultimately you are very unlikely to reach.
Now, in many versions of the story, he makes some kind of commitment as a child to basically one day become Batman, to spend his life warring on all criminals.
I swear, by the spirits of my parents, to avenge their deaths by spending the rest of my life warring on all criminals.
And if you look at like the Gotham TV show, it's like him as a teenager basically like beginning the steps of like training to become Batman. And you kind of ask the questions like, Alfred, what are you doing here? You like get this kid into therapy. Like I don't think there's ever been a really solid explanation as to why Alfred just sort of went along with all this. I think the best excuse they gave was like, oh, like, he's like, he was in the Secret Service, or, he was like this, he didn't know how to be a parent.
Like, I don't totally disagree with that one. I think, but I always felt it was more out of loyalty. Like, he just, like, he was also caught up in the grief and didn't realize what was happening until it was kind of past the point of no return. And then after that, he kind of just said, well, I might as well help because I do have these skills that can be helpful. Or, like, I think that, honestly, I think the, like, I didn't know how to be a parent isn't really an excuse. It is very true. And he was in this, he was in the Secret Service. And at the beginning, it might have just been like, okay, this is getting his mind off of the, actual mourning, so I'm going to help him and train him. But yeah, I mean, obviously, but again, it's this weird thing because Batman has existed for a really long time. I think that originally people were a lot less like, yeah, Alfred should have gotten him into therapy. Like, obviously today it's super obvious, and I feel like there's more and more interpretations of Alfred where he is actively trying to stop him or to slow it down. But I think that, again, ultimately, if you take Batman where it started and where it was at, and you take Alfred as somebody who, for better or for worse, didn't know how to lead, only knew how to take orders. You know, he worked for Her Majesty's Secret Service, taking orders, doing what he's told, and then became a butler to kind of like avoid having to make decisions. It does make sense that he would let this kid kind of rule over and make his own decisions and just go with it.
Now, similar to the Superboy, I don't know if you know this, Beeper, but there's like a Silver Age version of Batman's origin where as a teenager he dresses up as Robin and then learns detective work from like a private eye. Like they go around basically like solving crimes together, and this detective like teaches Bruce about how to be a detective.
I did not know about that. I don't know how to feel about it because I do like any story that works into it the fact that Bruce Wayne is also very intelligent and a good detective, because that's kind of lacking in a lot of, especially the cinematic versions of Batman. Like either it's not there at all or there's like subtle things. Like it took me a while to realize the Dark Knight was trying to emphasize on his like detecting skills. I think partially because the Dark Knight, because I think partially because Batman Begins just ignores it almost completely. And then it feels a bit jarring, but then again, Dark Knight feels a bit jarring generally compared to Batman Begins. So, yeah, but it does seem a little strange. Like, does this does the private detective know who he is? Like that he's
Well, that's
Bruce
the thing.
Wayne,
He's
or is
wearing
it
a
just
Robin costume, so he has a secret identity.
Yeah, that just again, that seems even more irresponsible than Alfred letting him do what he wants. It's like this private detective's like, oh yeah, this teenager dressed up in a mask decided to come and tag in with me. Yeah, that's not a problem. Like that seems not only worse, but also kind of like the kind of thing a private investigator should, by the nature of his work, avoid like the plague.
Yeah, and it also takes away some of the agency from like actual Robin characters, because instead of them coming up with that persona themselves, it's like, oh, let me just take this costume out of my closet from when I was a teenager, and you can be what I used to do.
Yeah, especially Dick Grayson, right? Because normally he's normally the first Robin, and it's normally because like it's his circus costume, which I think is a nice way, and also a decent explanation as to why he's wearing super bright colors.
Yeah, they never
Whereas
give a good. It
Batman,
was the Silver Age, but
yeah, but even at that point, Batman's costume was gray and blue, not like super flowery.
so in the Silver Age, it was part of Bruce's story that he actually goes to college, like with the plan of becoming like a police officer and joining law enforcement in Gotham City. And then once he finds out that basically that some of the laws aren't like there's a difference between like following the law and I guess his idea of what justice is. He's like, like I can't serve genuine justice by following all the rules of the police, so I have to be a vigilante.
Yeah,
Th-
I like that. I like that better than it being like a more like, like the Dark Knight, Batman Begins, where it's like, this League of Shadows tried to make him more extreme. He's like, no, I'll do a slightly toned down version of that, where I don't kill people, but I do everything else very extreme. But
well, and this
I
is
don't
the thing.
know.
The modern explanation, I suppose, is that they explain that Gotham City is so corrupt that there's no way he can make the changes that needed to happen from within the system.
Yeah, and but I do think that both are kind of reasonable because, and again, it also, again, kind of depends on who killed his parents and why, because that also might make him realize, or not necessarily realize, but think that, yeah, no, this is not the right way to do things. I need something more. I need to be able to take out the criminal or make sure that they don't escape the justice system. And I think that's where you can play around with whether the criminal who shot his parent just escaped the justice system or disappeared kind of changes which aspect you'd want to go with for him.
And then we get to the years Bruce is away, like whether he's at college or like basically the time he spends preparing to become Batman. Now, I always hated Batman Begins because it makes it seem like he just sort of went to the one monastery and learned everything he needs to know to be Batman there.
Yeah, I have a weird relationship with those movies. I really liked them when they came out, and then as I got more into comics and more into Batman, I started hating them more and more. But I also it is this thing where it's like it's not that crazy to think that a guy that rich would just have a lot of leisure time to spend on other things. And so like the years away I think is better if he does it in a kind of more varied environment. And that's why I think like training to be a police officer would still make him without any suspicion go into some of the training he would eventually need to become Batman. But at the same time, you know, if Bruce Wayne gets private tutors to come and help him to do things, you know, he's a bored rich kid, nobody really pays too much attention to it. And so, you know, I don't like the idea of him winning or learning everything in one place. And I think it also kind of goes against the idea of like, again, there's an emphasis on him being a detective. There's also an emphasis on him being a jack of all trades and just being relatively good at everything because he kind of had to, which, you know, is the Sherlock Holmes school of detective work is like, well, no, you need to be able to know random stuff about a million different subjects because it might be useful as a clue. And so I like the idea of him, you know, going to college, getting kind of a general, like a very general learning base, and then using that to become more knowledgeable and therefore more dangerous or more efficient.
Yeah, because the original Batman comics, it just sort of suggests that, oh, like he learned forensic science on his own, he worked out a bunch on his own, he read some books, and then that's all that. Like that's basically how he prepared to be Batman. Like it doesn't really suggest that he ever really went anywhere because his original origin was pretty simple. And as time has gone on, I think writers keep kind of adding more and more locations to like where he went, and suggest that he did this over a number of years. So, you know, even in the animated series from the 90s, they explain that he spent time with an escape artist, that he spent time in Japan learning karate. I think they mentioned that he like learned how to drive fast cars somewhere. You know, there's versions where he goes to Africa and like learns how to hunt with some tribal hunters. There's a
Yeah,
version where
and
he goes to France and learns like basically, yeah, like how to be a bounty
fencing
hunter.
and how to, yeah. And I think those make sense and are a better version, you know. Again, it's the Samurai Jack. Have you seen Samurai Jack?
A little bit.
Okay, just do you know what I'm referring to though?
Kind of.
Okay, because in the first episode he's just sent all over the world to learn all of the different skills he'll need in his life. And I think that does make more sense for Batman than Superman. A, because he's got the money to do it without necessarily arising suspicion. And B, yeah, I think it is one of those things about Superman, like, as much as like there's this whole thing behind his fan base being like, oh, he's just so good at everything, he's so cool. I don't always agree with that, but I do think that there is something about putting a lot of emphasis on him being not necessarily very smart. Like he is very intelligent, but also just very good at adapting and, you know, being able to do lateral puzzle solving and using, you know, esoteric knowledge to figure things out. And I feel like anytime he has more time away from home and more time in a more varied environment, I think is better and makes more sense for where that esoteric knowledge comes from, right? And it's something that there's like a slight homage to in Batman '89, where he's like, when Bruce Wayne is in the armor room and he's like, "Oh, it's Japanese. How do you know? Because I bought it in Japan." It kind of implies that he does globetrot a little bit, and he has seen the world and been able to assimilate different ideals, which make him a kind of more complete person.
Now, the one thing from Batman Begins I think is a good part of the story is that time that he spends around the world basically living as like a vagabond. Like he has no money, no ID, and he's living as like a poor person as a criminal. I think just because he comes from like such a world of like privilege, I think it's I mean, if I was writing a Batman origin, I would probably write a period of time where he's like, yeah, living that vagabond lifestyle into his journey around the world.
Yeah, I did like that part of it, and I think it works out well. Even just learning to live off his wits, and also I think it makes him kind of more useful. Like we somewhat alluded to it when we were talking about like Moon Knight um last week, last time we recorded the podcast, where like the different personas are kind of like things that Bruce Wayne had to train himself to do, right? And you do have him putting on like disguises and trying to hang out by the docks in Batman the Animated Series, and that definitely is not something he could do if he hadn't gotten some level of like training for it, because that's not something that came naturally or that was part of his experience.
Now, unlike Clark, who goes from like, growing up in a small town to then having his time of solitude and then moving to the big city, he's still like a nobody. Nobody knows him. But with Bruce Wayne, it's like he's a fairly famous figure in the city, even as a child. So there's the different explanations to like, what does the public think about where Bruce Wayne went, and why was he gone for so long? In Batman Begins, again, they like to sort of he's declared dead, and so like people just assume he's dead until he like obviously isn't dead anymore. I think some versions it's like they try to explain his time in like overseas, like he was just being rich and like spending his money living a lavish lifestyle.
And also coping with the fact that his parents died, right? Because I do think that makes sense. Like, if you're that young when your parents pass away and you have that much money, you probably wouldn't stay in the place where they died and were killed despite the fact that they were trying to save it. Like, you know what I mean? I think it is pretty logical an explanation that he just did not want to be in Gotham for a while. And I do somewhat like some of the stories. Like, I think that the Batman did an okay job of it, in the sense that like they're setting up the fact that eventually Bruce Wayne is still fighting, in a sense. Like, if you know what I mean, like it's not as direct, and clearly he thinks that Batman is necessary to do the things that that must be done, but at the same time there is a certain aspect that Bruce Wayne is still trying to use his wealth to save the world. And I feel like the Batman didn't directly do that, but I hope it was a setup for that aspect of Bruce Wayne to be elaborate, like kind of built up in another movie, because I think it is an important thing that like his parents, he hasn't given up on trying to fight the good fight and to do things well for the sake of Gotham. It's just that he also is convinced that he needs to do more than just that.
Now, an interesting point of contrast between Superman and Batman is that Clark Kent develops his public persona as a unassuming, mild-mannered reporter, not because people would necessarily think that Clark Kent is Superman, but because Superman doesn't wear a mask. So he has to basically put on a mask as Clark Kent so that people wouldn't assume that they're the same person. This is in contrast to Batman, who Bruce Wayne is a very obvious candidate for Batman. He's got it's a publicly known thing that his parents were murdered as a child. Batman operates in such a way that it's clear that he would need financing and money in order to pay for all his gadgets. So Bruce Wayne, and then he added the fact he was gone for several years. That's like any version of Batman stories where like people actually start like putting the pieces together. It's like Bruce Wayne's an obvious candidate. So Bruce has to put on a public persona, even though he wears a mask. It's like the other elements, because he's such a well-known person, that he has to like work really hard in his public persona to make it seem like he couldn't possibly be Batman. He's too aloof. He's too selfish. He's too stupid. He's too lazy.
Yeah, but I think the best stories are where he hides it by claiming he's too busy. For two main reasons. The first one is because that makes more sense because he would still be trying to do things. And the other reason is that I just like the fact that kind of works into Lucius Fox and Alfred having a bigger role, which I like.
So there you have it. We have run through in under an hour the variations of both Superman and Batman's origins. It seems like if we were to try and sit down and write our own versions of these stories, it sounds like we'd be more in agreement on how to write Batman's story than Superman's.
Yeah. Although, can I also just mention the one I mentioned Red Sun, the weird one where Batman is actually a vampire. It's one of the alternate universes. I like that one.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
So it's time to go inside the Bat Jar and figure we're going to talk about next time we record. Oh boy, Star Wars: The Force Awakens.
How long has that been in there?
I can tell it's one of the original topics because it's written in highlighter.
Weirdly enough, though, Mjolnir and I are rewatching the prequel trilogies in anticipation for Obi-Wan, so I guess we could go from that to watching, I guess, I might watch it again, I might not.
Yeah, I think The Force Awakens is in the Bat Jar because it was we had started the podcast right before Rogue One came out, and then we've covered Last Jedi, Rise of Skywalker, and so we never had a chance to talk about Force Awakens as a movie itself. But it's been 7 years. Maybe it's aged better than I remember it.
Yeah, okay, I'll give it a watch at some point. I also feel like my opinions, though, on that one are less extreme because, I don't know, I do remember seeing it, and I came out of it and was like, I distinctly remember something my brother-in-law said after we watched it. He's like, well, that was a Star Wars movie. And I was like, you know what? That's an accurate description. That was a Star Wars movie. And that's all I really felt. Whereas Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, there were things I was actively disappointed that they didn't do. So I might... Yeah, I don't know if I have as strong an opinion, but maybe upon rewatching it, I'll be like, oh, yeah, this is so much worse or better, or there's an interesting thing I didn't see when I first watched it. Because I definitely felt that way about the prequels. They've grown on me more and more the more I've watched them. So
come back to the Bat Jar podcast next week when we talk about Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
And may the Force be with you.